The envelope had been sealed for 9 years. It sat inside a locked mahogany box, inside a locked drawer, inside a room that only 2 people in the entire palace knew existed. One of those people was dead. The other was a royal guard named Colin Ashworth, and he was standing in front of that drawer right now, his hands shaking in a way they had not shaken since the day he first received his orders. Outside the window, London was gray and wet, the way it always seemed to be when something important was about to happen. Inside, the palace was quiet. It was early morning, the kind of early that feels stolen, before the staff arrived and the day's machinery began turning. Colin had timed it that way on purpose. He was 54 years old. He had served the royal family for 26 of those years. He had stood in rain and heat and biting wind without flinching. He had watched funerals and coronations and the slow, ordinary passage of history without letting a single emotion cross his face. That was the job. That had always been the job. But his hands would not stop shaking. He did not open the drawer yet. Instead, he stood there and let himself think about the morning, almost a decade ago, when everything changed. That detail had always seemed wrong to him. Important things, he felt, should happen on days that felt important. Not Tuesdays, but there it was. A Tuesday in September, and a quiet summons delivered by a page who did not make eye contact, which meant the summons came from somewhere very high up. He had been brought to a sitting room he had never entered before. Small, warm, smelling faintly of roses. She was already seated when he arrived. No other staff, no aides, just her in a pale blue dress, with a cup of tea she was not drinking. She had looked at him for a long moment, the way she sometimes did, the way that made you feel she was reading something written on the inside of your chest. Then she had said his name, just his name, quietly, the way you say the name of someone you trust. And she told him what she needed him to do. Colin had not spoken during the telling. He was trained not to speak. But by the time she finished, he understood that this was not a royal order in any normal sense. This was something personal, something she could not give to an aide or a secretary or a member of the formal household staff. It required someone who would remember, and someone who would act, and someone who would carry the weight of it in silence for however many years it took. She had chosen him. When she finished speaking, she handed him the envelope, already sealed, already addressed in her own handwriting. He had looked at the name on the front and kept his face completely still, though something had moved in him then, deep and private, like a stone dropping into dark water. He had been carrying it ever since. Not literally. The envelope lived in the box, in the drawer, in the room, but he carried it in every other way. He thought about it when he woke up. He thought about it during long ceremonial stands when there was nothing to do but be still and think. He had thought about it at her funeral, standing in the cold watching the world say goodbye, knowing he was the only person present who understood that she had not quite finished yet, because she had made a plan, and the plan depended on a boy who was, as of 3 days ago, 12 years old. Prince George Alexander Louis had turned 12 on a Thursday at a private family celebration that Colin had not attended. He was not the kind of guard who attended celebrations. He was the kind who stood outside them. But word had reached him the way word always reached him, quietly and without ceremony. The boy was 12 now, which meant it was time. The box was exactly where he had left it, undisturbed, covered in a light film of dust that confirmed no one else had touched it. He pressed his thumb to the small brass lock, turned the key he had carried on his person every single day for 9 years, and lifted the lid, still sealed, her handwriting still dark and precise on the front. He did not open it. His orders were not to open it. His orders were to deliver it. That distinction had kept him awake more nights than he could count. He did not know exactly what was inside. She had told him enough to understand the weight of it, but not enough to know the words. Those words belonged to the boy, to the 12-year-old prince who had been 4 years old the last time he had been in the same room as his great-grandmother, who probably remembered her only in the soft, blurred way that small children remember large presences. A warmth, a smell, a feeling of being seen. Colin lifted the envelope carefully, as if it might dissolve. He held it for a moment. Outside, the rain picked up, tapping against the old glass in a way that sounded almost like it was trying to get his attention. He thought about the instructions she had given him. Precise, considered. She had thought through every scenario, every possible complication, with the careful thoroughness that had defined her entire life. She had thought about what would happen if the boy was not ready. She had thought about what would happen if the family objected. She had thought about what Colin himself might feel, carrying this for so long. And she had acknowledged it, briefly, in that warm and private room. She had said, "I know this is a heavy thing to ask of you, Colin." And he had said, "It is not heavy, ma'am." He had meant it then. He still meant it now. He placed the envelope carefully inside the inner pocket of his jacket, close to his chest, and buttoned it shut. Locked the drawer, smoothed his jacket, stood straight. Colin Ashworth walked out of the room and into the rest of his life, carrying the last words of a queen toward a boy who did not yet know they were coming. The palace corridors were beginning to wake up around him. Footsteps in the distance, the sound of a door, the smell of early coffee drifting from somewhere below. He walked past all of it without looking. He had a delivery to make, and whatever was written inside that envelope, whatever she had decided 9 years ago, that her great-grandchild needed to know at the age of 12 and not a moment before, was no longer his to hold. It was time. It had always been going to be time. He just had not known, until this gray and shaking Tuesday morning, how much he had dreaded the moment arriving. Because, once he delivered it, the weight would lift. And he had been carrying it so long, he was no longer sure he knew who he was without it. The protocol for requesting a private audience with a member of the royal family, when you are a guard and not a secretary or aide, is not written anywhere. It exists in practice, in the understanding of how things move inside institutions that have been operating for centuries. Colin had navigated it before, for smaller things. A word passed to the right person at the right moment. A request framed as a matter of household business, not personal audience. But this was not smaller things. He spent the morning going about his regular duties, which on that particular day involved a security review of the East Garden entrance and 2 hours of standing post near the formal reception rooms. Ordinary work, the kind of work his body did automatically, while his mind ran through the possible approaches. He could not go through the family's private secretary. That would require explaining the nature of the request, and the nature of the request was something he had sworn to keep between himself and the late Queen. He could not go through the king's household for the same reason. He could not simply appear and ask. He had thought about this many times over the years, and always arrived at the same answer. When the time came, he would go through Caroline. Caroline Watts was 61 years old, and had been a senior housekeeper in the royal household for 34 years. She was not glamorous and she was not powerful in any formal sense, but she was the kind of person that institutions run on. She knew where things were. She knew how things moved. She understood, without ever having been told directly, that certain things happened in palaces that did not appear in any official record, and did not need to. More importantly, she had been in the room that Tuesday morning. Not the whole time. She had been the one who brought the tea, and she had been the one who left when Colin arrived. But she had been there long enough to understand, from the expression on the Queen's face and the deliberate way the door was closed, that something was happening that was outside the ordinary machinery. She had never asked him about it in 9 years. That was how Colin knew he could trust her with the next step. He found her after lunch in the corridor outside the linen storage on the 2nd floor, checking inventory with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. She looked up when he approached and read his face in that quick, practiced way she had. She said quietly that he needed to speak with Prince George privately, that it was a household matter of some sensitivity, and that he was not at liberty to explain it through normal channels. Caroline looked at him for a long moment, not suspicious, not confused, reading. Then she said, "His schedule has a free half-hour at 4 this afternoon. He usually spends it in the small library on the 3rd floor, reading. There's never staff in that room at that hour." Colin said, "Thank you." She said, "Colin, be careful with him. He's a serious boy. He'll carry whatever you give him." He said he knew. She nodded once and went back to her inventory. He had 4 hours. He spent them the way he spent most waiting time, with his body performing its required functions, and his mind very still. He had learned stillness young from a father who believed that preparation and patience were the same thing. His father had been an electrician, not a soldier, but the principle translated: you checked your work. You waited for the right moment. You did not rush the current. At 3:55, Colin walked to the 3rd floor. The small library was exactly as Caroline had described, a narrow room with 3 walls of bookshelves and a window seat that looked out over the rear gardens. Prince George was sitting in the window seat with a book, his knees pulled up, his dark head bent over the pages. He was wearing a plain navy sweater and looked, in that moment, less like a future king and more like any 12-year-old boy on a rainy afternoon. Colin knocked on the open door. George looked up. His eyes were careful the way children raised in public are careful, always assessing before they react. Colin said, "Your Royal Highness, I apologize for interrupting. I wonder if I might have a few moments of your time. It is a private matter." George looked at him with that steady, measuring gaze that his family seemed to be born with, set down his book, and said, "Of course." Colin stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The room felt very quiet. He reached into his inner jacket pocket, where the envelope had been resting against his chest all day, and drew it out. He held it for a moment, aware of the weight of it, the 9 years of it, the trust of it. Then he crossed the room and held it out to the boy. George looked at the envelope. His eyes moved to the handwriting on the front, and something changed in his face. Not dramatically, not the way emotion moves in people who have not learned to contain it, but in the small and careful way it moves in people who have been watching the world since they were very young. He recognized the handwriting. He looked up at Colin. Colin said, "I was asked to give this to you on the occasion of your 12th birthday. I was asked to give it to you personally without the knowledge of any other member of the household." George said, "By her?" Colin said, "Yes." George's hand came out, steady, not shaking the way Colin's had been that morning. He took the envelope. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a long moment. The way you look at something you know will change you before you let it. Then he looked back at Colin. He said, "Did you read it?" Colin said, "No." "Sir," George said, "but you know what it's about." It was not quite a question. Colin said, "I know what she told me. I do not know what she wrote." She kept those two things separate. George nodded slowly. He turned the envelope over once in his hands. Then he said quietly, more to himself than to Colin, "She always thought of everything." Colin said nothing, because that was the truest thing anyone had said all day. George did not open the envelope immediately. Colin had expected that. Actually, Colin had prepared for it in the way he prepared for most things, by thinking through every possible reaction and deciding in advance what his response would be. He had prepared for the boy to be frightened, to be confused, to demand explanations, to be dismissive, to cry. He had prepared for all of those. He had not fully prepared for the boy to simply hold the envelope quietly, look out the window at the gray London afternoon, and say, "Will you sit down?" Sitting in a private library with a member of the royal family, uninvited, without explicit clearance, was not something a guard did. It occupied a category of action that did not have a precedent, at least not in any manual Colin had ever read. George said, "Please, I think I'd like someone else in the room when I open it." That sentence moved through Colin in a way that made him understand, in a new and specific way, what Caroline had meant about the boy being serious. He was not asking for comfort. He was not asking for company in a childish sense. He was making a deliberate choice about the conditions under which he would receive something significant. And he was doing it calmly. 12 years old. Colin sat down. He chose a wooden chair near the door, the most formal seating option in the room, which felt like the right call. He sat straight. He folded his hands. He tried to be a presence that was available, but not intrusive. George pulled the window seat cushion more squarely beneath him. He looked at the envelope one more time. His thumb moved along the sealed edge. Then he opened it. The paper inside was cream-colored, the kind the palace used for formal correspondence. It was folded once. George unfolded it carefully. His eyes moved across the page in that quick, focused way of someone who reads a great deal. Colin watched his face. He had thought a great deal about this moment over 9 years, and he had imagined it many ways. What he had not imagined was the particular quality of stillness that came over the boy as he read. Not shock, not grief, something more interior than either of those, something that moved through him and then settled, like sediment after water is disturbed. George read to the end. He did not read it again immediately. He held the paper in both hands and looked out the window for a while. Then he said, "She wrote that I would ask you what she told you to do." Colin said, "She told me that was likely." George said, "And she wrote that you would not tell me unless I asked you directly," and used those exact words. Colin said, "Yes, sir." George turned and looked at him fully. He said, "What did Queen Elizabeth command you to do?" Colin had been holding those words inside him for 9 years, and now they came out cleanly and without ceremony, the way things do when they have been contained for a long time and finally have somewhere to go. He said, "She asked me to find you at the age of 12 and deliver the letter, but that was only the first part. The second part was this. She asked me to tell you that there is a room in this palace that you have never been shown. She chose not to tell your parents about it. She chose not to tell the household staff. She chose you specifically. And she asked that you be given the knowledge of it at this age, and not before, because she believed that 12 was the age at which a person becomes old enough to understand the difference between a secret and a burden, and young enough to still believe that some things are worth protecting. George was very still. He said, "The room contains things she wished to pass to you that she could not pass through formal channels. Letters, a journal, several objects of personal significance that she did not want to become part of any official archive or public collection. They belonged to her life as a person, not her life as a queen, and she wanted them to go to you." George said, "Why me?" Colin had expected that question too. He said, "She told me that of all the people who would come after her, you were the one who reminded her most of herself at that age. Not in temperament, in something harder to name. She said you watched things the way she had watched things. She said you understood that being seen and being known are not the same." George was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Where is the room?" And as he said it, he felt the weight he had been carrying for 9 years begin, very slowly, to lift. It did not go all at once. It did not work that way. But something shifted, the way something shifts in a house when a door that has been shut for a long time is finally opened. Not relief exactly, more like the quiet that comes after a very long sound stops. George folded the letter back along its original crease. He held it carefully. He said, "Will you take me there?" Colin stood up. He said, "Yes, sir." That was also part of the instructions. The route to the room was not long, but it felt long, the way routes feel when the thing at the end of them is significant. Colin led Prince George through a back corridor on the 3rd floor that most of the staff used only as a shortcut between 2 busier wings. The walls there were plain, maintenance painted, without the portraits and ornate moldings of the public spaces. It was the part of the palace that existed to make the other parts function. Invisible infrastructure dressed in neutral colors. Halfway down, there was a door. It was not a remarkable door. It had been painted the same off-white as the walls around it, deliberately at some point in the past. There was no sign, no handle plate of particular distinction. The lock was a standard Yale type, the kind on 100 other doors in the building. Colin produced a second key from his jacket pocket. This one he had never carried on his person. It had lived in a separate location, accessible only to him, retrieved that morning alongside the envelope. The room on the other side was small, perhaps the size of a large walk-in closet, with a ceiling just high enough not to feel cramped. The air inside was cool and still, and carried that particular smell of old paper and cedar that accumulates in enclosed spaces over years. Along one wall, a set of shelves held several wooden boxes, each labeled in that same precise handwriting that had been on the envelope. Along the opposite wall, a simple writing table held a reading lamp and a shallow tray containing 3 objects: a small framed photograph, a worn leather journal, and a single ivory-colored chess piece, a queen, standing alone in the center of the tray. George stepped inside. He did not say anything for a long moment. He moved to the shelves first, reading the labels on the boxes without touching them. Then he crossed to the writing table and stood before the 3 objects. He picked up the photograph first. Colin could not see the image from where he stood by the door. He did not try to see it. That was not his business. George looked at it for a long time. Then he set it down gently. He picked up the chess piece, held it in his palm. It was clearly old, the kind of old that comes from handling the ivory worn smooth in the particular places where fingers rest. He said, without looking up, "Did she play chess?" Colin said she did. She played every Sunday evening when her schedule allowed. George said, "With who?" Colin said, "Different people over the years. In her later years, mostly alone." George set the chess piece down. He reached for the journal last, but did not open it. He just held it closed, both hands around it, the way you hold something when you are not ready to go inside it yet, but you need to feel that it is real. Colin stood at the door and let him have the moment. Outside, faintly, came the sound of the palace resuming its afternoon operations. Footsteps, a distant telephone, the ordinary sounds of an institution continuing to function. Inside the room, a 12-year-old boy stood with a dead queen's journal in his hands and took a breath that was slightly slower and deeper than his previous breaths. Then he turned around. His face had not collapsed into emotion. It had done something more complicated than that. It had settled the way a face settles when it has received something very large and decided to carry it. He said, "She thought I'd understand all of this." Colin said she was certain of it. George said she was wrong. Colin said nothing. George said, "I don't understand it yet, but I think I will." He looked around the room once more. Then he looked at Colin. He said, "Will you help me?" Colin had been waiting for that question, or something like it, without knowing he was waiting for it. He had delivered the envelope. He had spoken the instructions. He had brought the boy to the room. His formal obligation, the one spelled out in specific terms by the woman who had given him this task, was complete. But George was looking at him with that careful, measuring gaze, and what he was asking was not logistical. It was not about boxes, or journals, or the management of a secret room. It was the same question Colin had heard 9 years ago in a small, warm sitting room that smelled of roses, expressed differently by a different person, but carrying the same essential weight. "Will you be the one who holds this with me?" Colin said. "Yes, sir." George nodded. He tucked the journal under his arm, set the chess piece in his jacket pocket, and picked up the photograph again. Then he walked to the door, stopped beside Colin, and said, "Same time next week." Something moved in Colin's chest. Not quite a laugh, the ghost of one. He said, "Same time next week, sir." George walked out of the room and back toward the corridor, heading in the direction of the main palace, with the calm, purposeful stride of someone who has decided what to do next. Colin stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at the shelves, the boxes with her handwriting on them, the table with the reading lamp, the tray now holding only the chess piece's empty space. He thought about a Tuesday morning, 9 years ago. A woman in a pale blue dress and a cup of tea she never drank. The weight of a sealed envelope placed in his hands. He thought about what she had said to him at the very end of that conversation as he turned to leave. He will ask questions you cannot answer and go quiet when you expect him to speak. But he will carry it correctly. I am certain of that. Colin switched off the reading lamp, stepped out, and locked the door behind him. Some things, even after the job was done, were still worth keeping close. 3 weeks passed. George came to the room twice. Both times Colin met him there at 4 in the afternoon, and both times George arrived with the same composed punctuality that was starting to feel like its own kind of communication. He was not casual about this. He was not treating it as an adventure or a novelty. He came the way you come to something you have decided to take seriously. The first visit after the initial one, he opened 2 of the boxes on the shelves. Colin stood by the door as always and watched the boy work through the contents with careful hands. There were letters in the first box, bundled in groups with thin ribbon, organized by year. There were small flat objects in the second, postcards, folded programs from events, a pressed flower that crumbled slightly at the edges when George held it up to the light. Things a person keeps not because they are important to anyone else, but because they are important to the specific private life being lived. George read some of the letters without speaking. He set others aside. He asked no questions that session. He just moved through the contents with that systematic, quiet attention, and Colin began to understand that the boy was doing something deliberate. He was building a picture, not quickly, not impatiently. He was laying piece beside piece, the way you assemble something that deserves patience. The second visit, he opened the journal. That one Colin noticed more, because George sat down at the writing table to do it, which he had not done before. He settled into the chair, placed the journal on the table in front of him, and opened it to the first page. He read for a long time without moving. At one point he stopped, and Colin, from his position by the door, could see the slight change in the set of his shoulders. Not distress, not grief, something more like recognition. After a long while, George said without turning around, "She wrote about making mistakes." Colin said, "Yes, George said she made a lot of them." George said, "That's not what they teach you." There was no bitterness in it. It was just an observation, the kind a 12-year-old makes when he has just received information that corrects something he was given incorrectly. Colin said, "No, it isn't." George was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She was harder on herself than anyone else was on her." Colin said, "That is also accurate, sir." George turned a page. On the 4th week, he arrived with a notebook of his own. Colin noticed it immediately. A plain dark blue notebook, the cheap kind you buy at any stationery shop, tucked under George's arm when he came through the door. George did not explain it or reference it. He simply set it on the writing table alongside the journal, opened both, and began making notes. That was when Colin understood that George was not simply receiving what had been left for him. He was responding to it. He was beginning a conversation with someone who was no longer there, using the only means available. He was writing back. Colin stood at the door and felt something he could not have named cleanly. It was not grief, though it touched grief on one side. It was not pride, though it touched that on another side. It was closer to the feeling of witnessing something that has been set in motion arrive exactly where it was aimed, after a very long journey. She had known. She had known this boy would do exactly this. 5 weeks in, George said something that changed the shape of things. He had been reading for about 20 minutes, making occasional notes. And then he set the pen down and looked at Colin in a direct and deliberate way that meant he had been thinking about something for a while. He said, "You've been carrying this for 9 years." Colin said, "Yes, sir." George said, "Why did you agree to it?" The question was plain and genuine, not challenging, not rhetorical. Simply curious in the way that people are curious when they have been thinking about something from multiple angles and genuinely do not know the answer. He said, "Because she asked me to." George said, "That's not quite enough, is it? People get asked to do things they say no to." Colin looked at him. He said, "No, it isn't quite enough on its own." He thought for another moment. Then he said, "I believed she was right about the letter needing to reach you, about you being the right person to receive it. I don't always understand the decisions made in this family or in this institution, but that particular decision I understood. And when you understand something, carrying it doesn't feel like a burden in the same way." George was quiet. Then he said, "She wrote something in the journal about the people who made her work possible. Not the official people. The people no one reads about. She wrote that the institution would have collapsed without them, and that the most important quality those people had was that they acted from understanding rather than obligation." He looked at Colin. He said, "I think she was thinking of people like you when she wrote that." Colin said nothing. George said, "I want you to know that I understand what you did, and that I'm going to remember it." Colin stood straight. He said, "Thank you, sir." George turned back to the journal. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of pages turning and the faint, distant life of the palace continuing outside the door. And Colin Ashworth stood at his post, the way he had